Hello, and welcome to Strange Detectives, a YouTube channel about strange and unusual detective fiction. My name is Xavier, and I know exactly what you're thinking right now. You are both disgusted and amazed that I would dare show my face on this booktube channel without my background of beautiful, albeit slightly out of focus bookshelves. Trust me, this is just as painful for me as it is for you. I'm still trying to sort out this couch situation. But also, things aren't always what they seem. What if I told you that the black picture frame behind me, which I'm sure to you looks like an empty black poster frame, wasn't empty at all? What if I told you that that black picture frame actually contains all 265,000 words of James Joyce's 1922 erotic thriller, Ulysses? That's right, all 265,000 words of Ulysses printed out in 2.5-point font. So, you know, it's not technically a beautiful, slightly out of focus bookshelf, but it is a beautiful, slightly out of focus book. And that's gotta count for something, right? I mean, I also got a houseplant into this shot. Thanks for noticing. And between the Ulysses poster and the houseplant, I feel like I've gotta be good for like, you know, at least one rainbow sorted bookshelf, right? So, I've got to be honest, last week's video kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. You know, I set out to create this channel in order to talk about strange and unusual detective fiction, only it turns out that neither one of last week's novels, although they were both weird, were particularly strange when it came to their detective fiction. You know, they both played it straight. Neither one really broke or bent any of the rules of traditional detective fiction. You know, I've watched episodes of Law & Order: Criminal Intent that do more to deconstruct the tropes of detective fiction than either The City and the City or Finch even come close to doing. Ow! So, in what is probably a gross overreaction, this week I have tried to push the pendulum as far as I possibly can in the other direction. Because this week we're talking about a really strange piece of strange detective fiction. This novel breaks pretty much every rule in the book, and it's absolutely one of the most puzzling and enigmatic and strangest pieces of detective fiction I've ever read in my entire life. In fact, I have no idea what happens in this book. Now, there are no mushroom people in this book, and there's no time travel, there's no Hamlet cyborgs or vampires or anything like that, and yet the list of unanswered questions I have about this book still runs a mile long. You know, if you came up to me right now and asked me about major plot points in this book, I would just look at you with a blank expression. I still have no idea what occurs or why in most instances. And this is not for lack of trying on my part, believe me, because I've read this book or reread this book like a dozen times at least, even more if you count like partial read-throughs. You know, thinking about it, this is actually probably the piece of detective fiction I've reread the most in my life. Which isn't as arduous as it sounds because this is actually a fairly slim book. My own copy only runs 150 pages or so. Here it is, by the way. I should probably, you know, introduce the book that we're going to be talking about today. Well, it's A King Alone by Jean Giono, first published in 1947. And take a look at that NYRB cover, by the way. I mean, it's just beautiful. C'est fantastique. If you're not familiar with the NYRB Classics Press, by the way, you gotta check it out because it's one of my favorite presses going. They're basically like a clearinghouse for long-lost masterpieces as far as I can tell. It's basically their mission statement to track down unusual books that have gone out of print and, you know, try to preserve them. Or otherwise find foreign language books that never got a proper English translation in the first place and introduce them to English readers. You know, whenever I'm at a used bookstore and I see an NYRB spine, I pretty much just always buy it sight unseen. And it's almost always a writer I have never heard of in my life, and a title I've never heard of in my life, and then I sit down and read the thing, and I'm always blown away. You know, these books just like instantly catapult into some of my all-time favorite books. I recently discovered Renata Adler's Speedboat this way, and also D.G. Compton's The Seven Lives of Mortonhoe. And again, in both instances, you know, I had never heard of these writers before, I had never heard of these titles, And yeah, that probably says more about me than the NYRB. Fair. But still, in each instance, these books just like instantly catapulted into my Hall of Fame, you know? It was like, this is the best book I've ever read. Which, yeah, I get it, slow down, that's like recency bias.
Slow down.
But still, the fact remains that I've never once been disappointed with an NYRB title. And A King Alone is no different. You know, I probably discovered this book, you know, 2 or 3 years ago. And again, it was a writer I'd never heard of and a title I'd never heard of. And ever since reading it, you know, it's just like been on repeat in the back of my mind pretty much constantly. A little bit about Jean Giono, who, like I said, is a writer I wasn't really familiar with before I picked up this book. Giono was born in 1895, dies in 1970, and he spends most of his life in the rural alpine regions of southeastern France. And his personal biography is pretty fascinating. Giono basically reinvents himself 3 or 4 times over the course of his writing career. So in his younger days, apparently he was either lighthearted or I guess comic as a writer, although I can't say for certain because I've never actually read these books. But in any case, he sees action in World War I, and this really changes Giono's outlook as a writer. It also converts him into a dedicated pacifist, and pacifism would be a cause that Giono would go on to defend over the course of his life. In fact, he was even imprisoned for his pacifism because, you know, in the run-up to World War II, suggesting that peace was preferable to war with Germany was construed as being sympathetic to the Nazi cause. And he was actually imprisoned a second time after World War II, and also placed on a publishing blacklist, again for having supposedly been sympathetic to the Nazi cause during the German occupation of France. But then later it turns out that Giono wasn't a Nazi sympathizer at all, and was in fact, you know, intervening on behalf of his Jewish friends to keep them from the camps, and even sheltering victims of Nazi persecution in his own farmhouse. So, oops. Sorry. So, you know, having survived 2 world wars and having also suffered this additional humiliation, Giono becomes a much more cynical writer in the post-war period, which, fair enough.
Fair is fair. We didn't start this, we didn't mean it to happen, but we're not giving up till you pay.
As far as I can tell, I don't think Giono is ever formally associated with, like, the French existentialists. He's really more in, like, the André Gide school of French post-war fiction writers. You know, there's still something very fin de siècle that remains in Giono's writing. And our book today, A King Alone, comes from this later, much more cynical, and also much more experimental phase of Giono's writing career. All right, first of all, let's talk about the setting, because the setting of A King Alone really is extraordinary. This book takes place in the Haute-Provence region of France in the 1840s, in this remote rural village called Chichelion. A remote village called Chichelion, located in the heart of the French Alps. And this is a rugged, desolate, snowy, bleak place, you know? This is a place where everything is either covered in snow, or covered over in fog, or covered up with clouds. Now look, I know it's kind of a cliche whenever you're talking about a book whose action primarily takes place outdoors, to say something like, the setting itself is a character. But here at Strange Detectives, we don't mind cliches so much. And also, the setting really is extraordinary. I mean, it's absolutely marvelous. Giono's sense of place is incredible, and if this were just like a Zolo-esque, you know, social realist novel about a bunch of peasants living in the French countryside, I still think it would be worth the price of admission, because Giono's nature writing really is that enthralling. But this is not a Zola-esque social realism novel about rural peasants living in the mountainsides of France. This is a detective novel. Because in this rural alpine village, a serial killer is on the loose. Villagers begin to disappear. A pig is found with strange symbols carved into its back with a knife. And so, of course, a detective is sent for. And today's detective is Captain Langlois. And I love Langlois. I really do believe, and I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I believe that if this book were better known, that Langlois would be like one of the all-time great characters in literature. I think about him all the time, because there's this part of him where he really is like this godlike force of nature. You know, when the snow arrives, Langlois arrives, and then when the snow thaws, he decamps again. And there's something about his personality that reminds me of like a Captain Ahab from Moby Dick, or maybe the Judge from Blood Meridian. Not in the sense that he's like evil or, malignant or a bad guy. Although maybe he is evil. The book is pretty ambiguous on this point. In any case, he reminds me of like an Ahab or a Judge Holden in the sense that he has this like Miltonian quality to him. Everything he does inspires fear or awe. And all of his actions are coded in this cipher. Langlois is ineffable. He's like an Old Testament god in that way. But at the same time, there is this other part of Langlois' personality where, he's constantly reminding everyone of his human frailties. At one point early on, after the killings are discovered and Langlois is sent for, he gathers up everyone in the village and goes over like a checklist of helpful do's and don'ts for surviving a serial killer. He imposes the buddy system, lock your doors, don't go out after dark, that sort of thing. But of course, one of the villagers, nature calls, and they go out in the middle of the night and are immediately killed.
Well, duh.
And this particular disappearance sends Langlois into like a rage, and he specifically cries out, "I am not a god." And yet, despite these protests, he certainly behaves like a god. He acts like a god. He acts like a vengeful Old Testament god, specifically. But then again, this book is so ambiguous on so many points that it's very difficult to say. Is Langlois sincerely wrestling with his mortality? Or is he bored with it? Is he just detached? The literary critic Edmund White compares Captain Langlois to Sam Spade. And the first time I read that, I rolled my eyes and thought, well, there's a bit of puffery. Because, there's nothing in common between Captain Langlois and Sam Spade. Not in the sense, at least, that Langlois is like a Humphrey Bogart, wisecracking tough guy. But the more I think about it, the more I understand what White is getting at. In The Maltese Falcon, we're never really sure what motivates Sam Spade. Is it a moral code? Because if it is, it's like a secret moral code, which we're never really privileged to understand for ourselves. And if it isn't a moral code, then maybe he's just making it all up on the fly. In both instances, there is an ambiguity that I think White is right to point out. And one of the reasons why this text is so ambiguous in the first place, one of the reasons why I keep shrugging my shoulders so frequently, is that Giono uses this really interesting framing device. Basically, the idea is that there are these two amateur historians. They're like two armchair historians of the history of rural France. And they're hanging out one day and they're like comparing libraries, and the subject of the killings in the 1840s comes up. And one of the armchair historians, he says, we don't really talk about that kind of thing around here. And the other historian says, the narrator, he says, well, the only reason why you don't talk about it is because you don't actually know what really happened. But me, the narrator, I do know what happened. I'm going to set the record straight. And so he proceeds to tell us exactly what happened. Only the narrator himself doesn't know exactly what happened. What he actually gives us is like a series of anecdotes or conversations of conversations that he half remembers. So Giono himself referred to this technique as his chronique method. And in her introductory essay to the book, Susan Stewart compares all of this to like a children's game of telephone. Because, basically people are recounting what others have recounted to them, and then the narrator is recounting these recountances to us. And despite the narrator's bluster, despite his confidence that he's actually going to set the record straight once and for all, you can't help but feel that something vital has been lost along the way. If I'm making all of this sound very abstract or abstruse or like a whole bunch of literary highbrow nonsense, then I apologize because I'm doing a terrible job of explaining myself. This isn't like a difficult or a dense book, This isn't like James Joyce's 1922 erotic thriller, Ulysses. The language of this book is mostly plain and simple, and the action in this book is oftentimes exhilarating. One of my favorite passages in this story is the chase sequence, which is one of the longest bits of continuous action in the novel. A carpenter named Frederick II, or Frédéric II, I guess, Frederick discovers a dead body and sees the killer fleeing the scene of the crime. And he makes this impulsive decision, this almost suicidal decision, to follow the killer back to the killer's own home. Its conclusion is so shocking that, I mean, honestly, if you can see this coming, like, this doesn't surprise you at all, then good for you, I guess. But you're vibrating on some mystical plane that I'm not even aware of. Part of me just wants to read out the entire chase sequence, just so you don't think I'm being, like, melodramatic. But just consider this one paragraph here, which comes at about the halfway point of the chase sequence. Frederick II had become a fox. He was using all his cunning. Not a hair on his head was thinking of anything but cunning. As fat as he was, he had become silent and airborne. He moved like a bird or a spirit. He went from copse to copse without leaving a trace. With his primitive sense of the world, he will later say, without touching the ground. Completely different from the Frederick II of the Sawmill Dynasty, no longer on land where he needed to saw wood to earn enough to feed Frederick III. Frederick II was also in a new world, where you needed an adventurer's abilities, happy in an extraordinary new way. That he won't say. At first he only understood it confusedly, but even if he had understood it quite clearly, he wouldn't have said it. He would have hidden it forever, even at the final moment when he in turn would become a hunted man on the move. Happy in an extraordinary way just to imagine, no, that's too strong a word. To know instinctively that this new world was vast and limitless, similar to that archipelago of pale islands dotted with black that suddenly appeared through the shafts of luminous white powder on the far side of Larchot. I love this. I really love this. Because Frederick is basically given the chance to play detective. You know, he's basically thrust into the role of Captain Langlois. You know, he's following a serial killer through the mountains in the middle of winter, which is this suicidally stupid thing to do. But at the same time, it's like this primitive urge he's had his entire life finally has an outlet or gets a release. You know, Frederick is a hunter. He's a man-hunter, and somewhere deep inside the recesses of his lizard brain, this makes him happier than he's ever been in his entire life, even as it threatens to kill him. You know, he's never had so much pleasure. He's on cloud 9. His feet don't touch the ground. And this, I think, is as close as I'll ever come to understanding what motivates Langlois, because I think we're supposed to infer that it's this same thrill, this same pleasure that Langlois is seeking out. Langlois is addicted to the hunt. And the text suggests, I think, that this addiction is itself a kind of bloodlust, and that there's not so much a difference between the bloodlust that motivates Langlois and the bloodlust that motivates the madman himself. You know, the serial killer who's killing all of these villagers.
You and I are not so different.
Okay, so just to recap, we've got a 10 out of 10 setting, we've got an all-time detective, and we've got an absolute nightmare of a serial killer on the loose. So basically, we've got all of the makings of a crackerjack piece of detective fiction. Which means we've reached the point in the video where we ask the most important question. A question we will always try to ask and answer on this channel. Is the mystery any good? And the answer is no. Not really, no. Because in fact, I haven't really been playing fair myself. I've been kind of deceitful in this video up until this point. In fact, the actual mystery of the serial killer only makes up a small part of this novel. The whole thing from start to finish is basically over in the first 50 pages of this book. And Giono breaks basically every rule of classical detective fiction along the way. There's no clues, there's no suspects, there's no witnesses, there's no deduction or detective work of any kind.
Get out.
What?
Get out, I need to go to my mind palace.
So the book is actually split up into like 3 sections. Now in the first section, Langlois battles the serial killer. In the second section, he battles a wolf. And in the third section, Langlois battles himself. And I know that sounds needlessly ambiguous, but really I don't know how else to put it without ruining the novel for you. Langlois battles himself. And yet the way that Langlois chooses to resolve the mystery of the serial killer is so shocking and surprising and mysterious, I mean there really is no other word for it, that the rest of the novel is more or less dedicated to trying to understand the significance of the first mystery. who is Langlois? Why does he do the things that he does? What really happened between Captain Langlois and the serial killer? And it's this second mystery that's the real mystery of the book, I think. Because this second mystery has lots of clues and lots of suspects, and it's the reason why I keep reading and rereading this book again and again, trying to get at a solution. We find out that Langlois was a veteran of the French invasion of Algeria in 1830. And sometimes I think that this is a helpful tidbit, and sometimes I don't know what to make of it at all. Similarly, Langlois' only real friend in the village, his only confidant, is a former prostitute named Sausage who keeps a cafe. Again, why her? Perhaps it's because her former time as a courtesan gives her secondhand experience with soldiers and soldiering. And perhaps this is why the two of them form this jaded, world-weary Holmes and Watson duo. In winter, there wasn't much happening at the Café de la Route. Around noon, 4 or 5 old men would come to drink a sou's worth of laced coffee. They would stay there until 3, sleeping around the stove. Sausage would sit near Langlois, and they would discuss the ways of the world. "What would you do with a dead man?" Langlois would say. "Nothing," she'd respond. "Obviously," said Langlois. It was, like the previous years, a heavy, overcast winter, black with snow. Again, I love this because it's fascinating how much ambiguity Giono can sneak into such a simple passage, right down to that final line, winter, black with snow. So there you have it, Jean Giono's A King Alone. If you're looking for a fun Agatha Christie romp that takes place in the Alps, then this isn't it. But if you're looking for a quick read to ping-pong around the inside of your skull for a few years, then yeah, absolutely. I can't think of a better way to pass the time than with Langlois and Sausage by their fireplace, plotting revenge against the madmen and the wolves of the mountainside. I should also add that one of the reasons why I've reread this book so many times isn't that I'm a mystical cleric who thinks that this is a religious text worth devoting my life to. I don't have red string posted up in my bedroom. Actually, it's because I just happen to reach for this book whenever I go camping, it seems. It's the perfect book for that kind of thing. It's short, it's a little creepy, you can read it by the fire and listen to the coyotes and give your spine a bit of a tingle, All right, so if there's nothing else, the book is A King Alone. The writer is Jean Giono. My name is Xavier. This is Strange Detectives, and I'll see you next week.